Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett, co-founder at Launch Academy, here to bring you another episode of the HTML show. We're continuing our exploration of cascading style sheets and applying styling rules to the context of our CSS web pages. And today we're going to tackle a particularly tricky topic, and one topic that is going to be thematically used throughout the duration of the program. We're going to talk about the CSS Box Model. So we're going to start to add dimension with things like width, height, margin, padding, and border to basically make our web pages look increasingly more beautiful. The thing that you should know in advance is that this is one of the more difficult topics that we'll cover in the course, and you may not immediately get everything all at once. But the important thing is to really wrestle and work with this material, and we're going to provide you with some great visualizations and some great tools to really help you grok the concept of the CSS box model. But it may not come naturally, it may not come right away, but just continue to at least try to understand what I'm explaining conceptually, and hopefully through your tinkering and through your own work, and you're doing the work alongside me, right? Hopefully through all of that, you'll start to get a better feel for how the box model is going to work. And again, I just want to emphasize the importance of getting involved in our community. We've got awesome people in our Slack chat channel showing their work, sharing their markup, and I'm really happy to be providing them with code review and feedback that's benefiting the entire community. So if you're watching us live, I hope you'll go ahead and ask some questions in Slack as we cover some of these more difficult concepts. But also, if you're not watching us live and you're not yet in the Slack conversation, I want to stress to you that it doesn't matter if you're following along with us 2 weeks behind, 4 weeks behind, even a year from now at the time of this recording. I want you to jump into Slack, share your code, show your work, and I know at least I'll be there. I'm sure there'll be peers with you as well. So we want to get you involved in the conversation. We want to get you involved in the community. So if you haven't yet joined Slack, please go ahead and do so by going to the html-show-slack.launchacademy.com. Again, it's html-show-slack.launchacademy.com. You can leave your email, you get an invitation to Slack, and the download's really simple to get going in that chat channel. So go ahead and get involved in that conversation. If you're not watching this live, hit the pause button. Go do it. Let's get involved. I want to hear from you. Anyway, getting back to the specifics of today's episode, we're going to start to look at how we can incorporate the setting of width, height, padding, margin, and border in the context of our CSS and our HTML documents. Along the way, we're going to learn some neat tricks with things like min height or max width, as well as how to set the overflow of our HTML elements, so be on the lookout for that. We're also going to be making use of the important keyword and making a small sort of caveat to why you can use it, but you really should avoid using it as much as possible. So to drive home this point of the box model, I think it's really important to establish a visualization or sort of a mental model for what this looks like. And to do that, I'm going to use a little trick to show you how every HTML element on your web page is actually a rectangular box. It's got width and height. And we're going to do so using a special selector that's called the wildcard selector. And the star in most programming paradigms is often referred to as a wildcard character. We're going to actually set a border on all of our elements. And I'll speak specifically towards what this is and what we're doing here as we cover the border rule in further detail. But first, I just want to show you how this affects the makeup of our page. So see here, we've got this idea of setting the border on all of our elements on the page. And you can think of your HTML document as essentially a set of nested rectangles for you to manipulate stylistically using the box model attributes. So what we've done here is we've said for every HTML element on the page, we're going to provide a 1 pixel solid red border around that. So you can see that for every HTML element that we have on our page, we've assigned a red border to it. and you can really get an understanding here of the structural makeup of our HTML web page. So we see how every single HTML element itself is a box. And these boxes behave differently on whether they're inline versus block level elements. As you can see, our inline elements here and our block level elements like our head 1, which is actually taking up the entire width of the page. So we're starting to see how these elements can essentially be manipulated so that we have differences in white space. For example, look at this unordered list where we've got the disks to the left of the list items taking up a certain amount of width, and then the actual list items themselves showing up roughly about 30 to 50 pixels to the right of the disks, right? So we've got some interesting nesting and hierarchical relationships that have an effect on our overall box model. But to drive home this point of visualizing the box model, I thought it would be really neat to share with you a tool that I find helpful, and I show to all of our students, essentially so that you can see how changing things like the width and height of our HTML element can have an effect on the overall box model. But so what does it mean by the overall box model? Well, we've got the concept of every single element actually having its own width and height. So to drive this home, I'm actually going to establish width and height for this "Hey, check us out at Launch Academy" aside that we produced. So let's go ahead and do that. So if you remember, we have this aside that right now exists on its own line. So we're going to take that aside and we're going to stylize it using some important box model attributes. So I'm going to use an element-based selector, and I'm going to specify the width with a static width and a height with a static height. And watch how this affects the red border that is around this element. See now that the red border actually doesn't go all the way to the full width of the HTML document. Because I've set the width to 400 pixels, the red border on the right actually occurs 400 pixels into the page. So we've assigned width and we've assigned height so that now this box is behaving a little bit differently. And width and height is sort of the center part of the whole box model paradigm. So we're setting the inside width and height of our box. And we can see that using the Chrome inspector and using a new tab or a new section that we haven't yet paid too much attention to. And you can see that the width and the height that I've set is in the innermost section of this box model sort of diagram that exists in our Styles tab of the Chrome inspector. So we see that we've set 400 by 200 here. But what are these padding, border, and margin elements that essentially comprise the rest of the box model? Watch what happens when I set my padding to 50 pixels. Not only do we have the 400 by 200 pixels of white space that we assigned on our HTML element, when we inspect it, see the green that's showing up around the blue? So the blue here is indicating the 400 by 200 dimensions that we defined on the aside itself. And what you're seeing in the green on the underlying element underneath the Chrome inspector here is you're seeing the 50 pixels to the top, to the left, to the bottom, and to the right of the actual aside element itself. So we can see here how we've set a 50 pixel set of padding around the element as well. So now what we can do is we can actually set a margin of 25 pixels and see how that affects the relationship of the aside element with everything else that appears on the page. Notice now that we've got a little bit of a difference between the border of the HTML document itself and the aside tag. And that's because we've added a margin of 25 pixels that's basically going to separate our aside to the left. It's going to push it to the left 25 pixels. Now notice I'm a little bit zoomed in here, so you're not going to get like a pixel perfect accuracy here. But essentially we've gotten a 25 pixel push to the left and pushed down by 25 pixels. And then notice too that the image is 25 pixels further down because we've set the margin bottom here as well. So we can see how these width, height, padding, margin, and border attributes can have an impact on how our block level elements are displayed in our HTML documents. And to drive this home, let's take a look at this interactive box model tool that can really give us better perspective on this whole concept of the box model and how all of these CSS attributes are related to one another. So one thing that I'm going to recommend that you do through the duration of this course, and something that we think is particularly important when dealing with all of these box model attributes, we want you to set the border box and the box sizing so that it's accurate to what most web developers use. So there's two different ways we can determine the height and width of our elements. And most commonly, folks are going to use the border box setting. And the border box setting is going to measure the width and the height to the border rather than the differences between the width and the height of the element and the padding. So for our purposes, we're going to set the border box setting, and we're going to do so using some funky syntax that you may not be familiar with. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So we're going to set this, and we could set it in the HTML or in the body more accurately. Let's go ahead and do that. And notice here that I'm setting two CSS attributes. And for the first time, we're seeing what's called a vendor prefix on our CSS rule. And remember I shared that every browser has its own kind of funky interpretation of HTML and CSS? Well, MOZ is short from the Mozilla rendering engine, which is basically the open source version of what used to be Netscape Navigator. We call that the Mozilla engine, and it's what drives things like Mozilla Firefox, Opera, and in its underpinnings, the Chrome web browser as well. We call that a Gecko-based browser now, I believe. Everything, all the open source and sort of non-IE related web browsers tend to be based in Mozilla. But we use this vendor prefix to basically identify and set the box sizing for specific web browsers, in this case Mozilla-based web browsers. And then we're defensively doing the same, setting a non-vendor prefixed version with the box sizing here, and we're setting it to border box. And border box, again, will make the width and height calculations based on incorporating both width and the set padding inside our existing border box. So really important sort of perspective to have. So in other words, here I've set my width and my height to 400 and 200 pixels respectively. I've also set my padding to 50 px. Watch how setting our border box has impacted our CSS here. If you look, the effective width of our web page here is going to be actually 500 pixels. Right? Because we've got padding on the left and padding on the right. So we use the box sizing as a way to kind of centralize the way in which we're calculating our widths and our heights. If anyone has any questions, again, don't forget to just throw those in Slack as we go through this material. I want to answer your questions and make sure we're clear as we move through all of this material. All right. So, let's play around with this box model demo to show you how adjusting width attributes, as we see down here, actually affects the innermost piece of the box. And if I set my padding, it increases the green. And again, see how it's pushing down? That's because, on the blue, that's because we've set the box sizing to border box. If it's content box, the box just gets bigger. But if we're using border box as box sizing, we're going to have to include both our padding and our height and width inside the border. So that's why we really recommend the use of the border box box sizing as opposed to the content box box sizing. It's just a more truer representation of what the actual width and height of our element reflects. So see here as I play around with these how setting the padding affects the rest of the box model. And this is just a really cool tool to visually understand how changing these variables is going to affect the width and the height of our HTML element. Similarly with margin, see how our element is kind of getting pushed up and down based on the margin that we're setting. And we can do the same to the left and push things further to the left like we have seen here in our... Sorry, I just got a phone call. We can see here in our left-hand area how the margin changes. And if you remember, we set our margin left here in the example of our actual page, and we saw how that pushed the aside over by 25 pixels. So play around with this tool and really use it as an opportunity to get an understanding of how margin, padding, and border can affect the overall width and white space around an individual HTML element. It may help to drive home the point in the differences between margin and padding. So here we see that the border is around the width of the element and the padding of the element. And we can drive that home by actually setting the background color of our element here. So we'll set the background color to blue. So see that the box that we've drew here incorporates the width, height, and padding of the element. It does not include the margin. The margin affects the asides relationship with everything else on the page. It just introduces some white space between the element itself and any other material that's on the document. And we can see how that white space has affected the asides relationship with the navigation bar and with the image that we have directly below it. So we can use margin as a way to add white space between the element that we're stylizing and every other element on the page. Whereas padding adds internal white space on our element in addition to the width and the height that we've already set. Another important thing to know about our width and our height is that we can set minimum and maximum heights. So if I wanted to, I could set a min width and a min height to basically warrant that I'm saying that I can be at a minimum only 400 pixels wide and at a minimum 200 pixels wide. And this basically allows us to have content inside the page. If I added a bunch more text to our lorem ipsum, to our side here, and this element became ridiculously long and wide, see how the height of my HTML element increased. And that's because I set the min height and not just the height. Watch how this changes when I set the height to 200 pixels versus the min height. So let's go ahead and have both of those rules in here. See how the text has overflowed outside of the box. And this is a real problem for us in web design. We see this often where we design boxes for our HTML elements that do not sufficiently cover the text that it's supposed to contain. And this is known in web design as an overflow issue. Our text overflows the container that we put around it. So you want to be very careful in setting static widths and heights, because your content inside is often dynamic or different or changing from web page to web page. So you can often find these sort of what's known as overflow issues. And thankfully, if we wanted to, we could control this further by using the overflow attribute in our CSS rules. So if we wanted to hide any overflow, so for example, all the lines that are showing up here outside of the box, we could set our overflow property to hidden. Watch how that affects the content inside my blue box. It's now hidden. If I wanted to actually provide a way for a user to scroll, we could do so using the scroll overflow value. And now I can actually read all of the text, but it's in a fixed height sort of scenario. And then lastly, we can actually let the browser decide by setting the auto value. And here the browser decided to use a scroll. And when you set the auto value, the browser kind of has a mind of its own and tries to guess at what would be the best paradigm. I really recommend, if you're going to set overflow, that you do so explicitly. So use the overflow auto sparingly. So we've talked about setting margin and padding here briefly as part of the overall box model, but let's dive specifically into the margin and padding style rules. So here we've seen that we've set margin and padding for all four dimensions: the top, the left, the right, and the bottom of our HTML element. And this is known as shorthand notation. And this works when we want to set 50 pixels for the white space that occurs inside the box. I'm just going to actually get back to our original state here. Get rid of some of this lorem text. Refresh the page. So see this white space between the hey text and the border, the red border that we have here. This is the padding. This is 50 pixels of padding. And the shorthand notation works well if I want the same padding all around my element. So we've got 50 pixels on top of the element, 50 pixels to the left of the element, 50 pixels on the bottom of the element, and 50 pixels to the right of the element. And this works great if we want to uniformly set our sort of padding across the board. But often what we need to do is we need to set individual padding attributes for the top, left, right, and bottom aspects of our box. So we can set padding left to a different value so that we don't necessarily need to have uniform padding in all four directions. See how that changed our box model? And we can confirm that using the Chrome inspector to see here that we've got different padding values on the top, on the left, on the bottom, and on the right of our CSS box here. So we see how that changes. And what we can do is we can use a shorthand notation to basically reflect the same context of padding. And we can do so by mimicking the clock. We're going to basically set the top first, the left second, the bottom next, and then the right. So if you think of working counterclockwise in the context of a clock on the wall, you would set your top first starting at 12 o'clock, then you would set your left starting at 9 o'clock, and then your bottom at 6 o'clock, and then your right at 3 o'clock. So you go all the way around the clock in a counterclockwise fashion, starting at the top, starting at midnight. So that is a shorter way of expressing all the CSS rules that we've defined on lines 53 through 56. So we can go ahead and comment those out. And just like in HTML, we can comment out certain markup, we can also comment out CSS rules using this /* syntax here. We can also set one line. Oh no, I don't think we can, not in CSS. You can set multi-line comments using this, and you can also set single line comments using this as well. All right. So see here that we have commented out the padding paradigms that we used here, and we see how the padding has been affected. So we see that we get 50 pixels on the top, 25 pixels to the left. Wait a minute, that does not look right. It's clockwise. I had that incorrect. So you start at midnight and you go to 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock and then to 9 o'clock. Sorry about that. So to clarify, this first set of digits is going to mean the top of the padding. This is going to set the right padding. This is going to set the bottom padding, and this is going to set the left padding. So I actually went in the opposite direction. Sorry about that. Likewise, if we know that we have the same top and bottom padding, and we have the same left and right padding, which is a pretty common paradigm, we can use two settings. With the first setting the top and bottom padding, and the second set of measurements representing the left and right padding. So if we comment this out, we'll see that our side now has 25 pixels of padding to the left, 25 pixels of padding to the right, and 50 pixels on the top and bottom of that element. Cool. All right, so that's sort of the academic pieces of margin and padding. And again, if you have any questions on margin or padding or the box model in general, just shoot us a note in Slack. Let's take a look at the border attribute that I kind of hand waved earlier in the context of our episode today. So I can set the border in such a way. So let's see how this affects our CSS element. That's a little hard to read, so let's actually set our border to yellow. And what we can do is we can increase the size of the border. And you see here that I've created a 20 pixel wide border on top and to the left, and on the bottom and to the right of our HTML element here. So I can actually also set specific borders for specific places to the top, to the left, to the right, and to the bottom of our HTML element. So let's go ahead and comment that out and see how that affects things. See here now, we've got only a border applied to the bottom of our side element. And we can do the same for the top. And we can do the same for the left and for the right. And what's really cool, as you might have guessed or played around with in the inspector, we can actually see how we can change these values and how that visually affects our page. If we go down to where the border is calculated, and I put my mouse and my cursor on the unit and I hit the up key, see how my border is expanding? And if I hit the down key, it will decrease the width of my border. So we can use the Chrome Inspector tool to help us as we work through incorporating designs and accomplishing the aesthetic that we're looking for. And we'll do more and more of that as we get deeper into the course. All right, so we covered sort of the academic aspects of margin, padding, borders. Let's talk a little bit more about how we can use these to improve the aesthetic quality of our page. So I'm going to get rid of all of the sort of the debugging and kind of funky styling that I've added here. And we're kind of back to where we were, and we can go ahead and... So this is where we were before the episode began. And notice that my width and my height is still applied to the aside here. If I wanted to, I could decrease the height, and we can use Chrome Inspector to kind of get a feel for what the value is that we want to use for a height here. See how my image is coming up closer? And that's because I'm decreasing the height or the box model real estate of my aside tag. And I might decide to incorporate the vertical align CSS rule to get my text to be aligned in the middle, or we could set the margin to 25%, the padding to 25%. That's not going to give us the aesthetic that we want. So we could set the padding to auto, again not giving us the aesthetic that we want. So we may just want to have this be static for right now. And what we can do is we can set our text alignment to center. And height of 200 pixels is going to be a little bit too large for us. So a 50 pixel height actually looks a little bit better. And let's go ahead and set a border of 2px, and we're going to use a solid style. And we'll use the pink that we've incorporated into the rest of the page. So we got to find that color, which is here. And what I can do is I can actually modify the border style to reflect a different style of border. So here I can say I want to make it dotted. And watch how that affects the style of my border. Great, okay. And I'm trying to get this vertical align to work, and I'm not sure why this vertical align is not helping us here. So what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate the height. And this is how you play around with the CSS Box Model, is you kind of play around and measure and see if you can get the aesthetic that you're working with. And then you kind of isolate variables, and you might change, for example, a static height to some padding. Watch how I do that here. So I might decide that I want a 50 pixel padding on the top and the bottom of my page, my aside element, and 25 pixels to the left and the right of my aside element. See how that affected the overall nature of my HTML element? That's a little too much, so I'm going to actually change this to be 20px and 10px. And that's giving me a little bit closer to the aesthetic that I want. And then with block level elements, it's actually really tricky to center align those block level elements when they don't take up the entire width of the page. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the margin to auto. I think it's actually 25%. Let's see how that works. So we're going to set the top and bottom margin to 0, but we're going to set the left and right margin to 25%. And that gives us roughly center. It's not pretty, but it's getting there. And I want a little space in between my nav bar and my image and the aside that I have. So I'm going to actually set a vertical margin of 10 pixels. So notice here too that I've mixed up pixel units in a percentage-based calculation. So this basically says of the available real estate that my aside takes up, I need to take 25% of that and essentially indent our aside element by 25%. And that will be on both the left and the right of my HTML document. And we see the 10 pixels of vertical real estate that we've introduced. So we get a kind of a neat sort of perspective of a dotted sort of call to action to check out Launch Academy. I'm pretty happy with that. That's decent. You know, I've got some work to do aesthetically for this page, but you know, the real purpose of what we're doing here is just to show you everything that CSS can do. So let's actually take a look at this nav element and see what we can do with the nav element. If you look, we've got links showing up. And what I want to do is I want to indent my important links a little bit so that it shows up more in the black or the gray that we've depicted here. So I could either set padding of my nav element, or conversely, I could set a margin on my H3. And these are some of the design decisions that you need to make as you start working with margin, padding, height, and width. For my purposes, I'm going to set padding because I think that that will allow me for more flexibility around the nature of my elements inside my nav. So I'm going to actually set padding on my nav element here. And I'm going to say I want 10 pixels of white space to the left and the right. And I don't really need any padding vertically. So 0 padding applied for the top and the bottom, 10 pixels applied to the left and the right of my nav element. See how that moved everything in a little bit? And now my important links is appearing at a more desirable place. Okay. Now notice that these links are pretty close together. Well, I don't really like that. I want to add some margin so there's a little more white space between all of my list items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new CSS rule, and I'm going to set the margin left to 5 pixels. See how that spread those elements out a little bit? And I'm noticing too that I don't really like the white space between my important links H3 and the unordered list itself. And that's because of the default user agent style that's actually applying I want to show this to you. A margin of 5 pixels and a padding of 40 pixels on the unordered list itself. So what I need to do is I need to set the margin of our unordered list to, the padding of our unordered list to 0 to essentially erase the user agent style sheet or the browser's opinion on how the unordered list should be displayed. So go ahead and do that. And now my links are actually closer to the important links, but that's a little too close. So let's go ahead and tweak the units on our CSS document here. So I'm just going to set the padding left here. All right, that's a more comfortable distance. So you can see the process of working through styling and making changes to these box models is you're kind of making one or two tweaks in the context of your CSS rules, and you're seeing how that affects the overall layout of the page. Cool. All right. Now, one thing I might want to do is I might want to give the effect of sort of a link bar, and typically what you see are sort of pipes in between all of these links. And we can do that with a kind of neat set of rules using the border attribute. So what we're going to do is we're going to set border right, and we're going to say 1 pixel solid, and we'll use the same sort of white that we're using here. And watch how this affects our page. See how now I have these white vertical lines? Well, now I have to have the same margin and padding to kind of give the effect of having the same white space to the left and to the right of our list items. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set our margin this way, and I'm going to set our padding similarly. It looks like we've got some default behavior that's getting in our way here. Let's find out what's going on. So we've got 5 pixels, 5 pixels. I think the UL might be affecting our padding here. No, that looks okay. So see here how I'm using the Chrome Inspector tool to basically try to understand where the additional white space is coming from. And it's because I've got margin and padding on my left. So I really just want to set our right margin and our right padding. So we're going to do so using that clock rule. So that essentially what I'm doing here is I'm setting my left margin to 5 pixels and my left padding to 5 pixels. I don't really want to do that. I want to match my border, so I'm going to set my right margin and padding. And let's see how that affects the aesthetic. That's looking a little better, but I want my distance to be a little bit cleaner in between our elements, so I'm going to add more white space. Cool. And then maybe I want to make my border a little bit thicker. There we go. That's looking great. I'm pretty happy with that. But notice here I've got this extra bar on my right, which is kind of redundant and looks a little awkward. So I need to isolate this particular list item using a special CSS selector. And I'm going to do so using a special pseudo selector called last child, which basically says for the last list item, I'm going to not apply a border. So I'm basically disabling the CSS rule here by being more specific about the last item in the list. So now that border has gone away. And if we inspect this, you can see the cascading nature of this relationship. So see here how we've got the list items border right. Well, the li last child is more specific. So it takes precedence or has a higher order of specificity than the previously established border right. So we're overriding the border right for the last element in the list. And you can see that here. And that's a common trick that we use to kind of mimic this idea of a list of links. And we can further make this pretty by setting a hover. And we'll use the gray as the actual color. See how that works. And watch how this gets applied. See how when I hover over these elements, the state changes, and I'm using a CSS selector for that. Pretty cool, right? If I wanted to, I could adjust this even further and get rid of the margin and set my rule this way. And see how now my padding takes additional white space when I mouse over. And I can set my margin explicitly to 0 so I don't have any white space. So you can see how you can start to tinker and play around with these box model attributes to basically achieve the aesthetic that you would like. For example, if I wanted a line to separate my intro with my paragraph text here, I could, for my H1 element, specify a border bottom, 1 pixel solid. And now I have a nice dividing line. And if I wanted that line to be further below the text itself, I could set my padding bottom to say 20px. And this is going to essentially push the line further down the screen. So you can start to see how playing around with this box model can really make you get very specific about the look and feel of your website. So keep playing around with the box model. It can be incredibly frustrating to deal with when you're first starting out, and you kind of need to develop a visual pattern in your head around some of the changes that you're making in your editor and how they'll affect your page. And take advantage of things like this interactive demo and playing around in Chrome Inspector to basically tweak and make changes to the units so that you can achieve the aesthetic that you want. So see here, I'm playing around with the padding attribute and seeing how that has an effect of the relationship between the line and my actual text. Play around with Inspector, play around with the interactive tool, and just try to achieve a certain aesthetic that you're looking for. And sometimes it can be helpful to kind of draw out what you're trying to achieve and then try to achieve that using the CSS Box Model. Great. So the last thing I want to talk about today is the important keyword itself. So we talked about how we can use the idea of specificity, like we did with this last child, to basically indicate what rules we want to apply. We use the cascading nature of CSS to basically override or overrule less specific rules or settings. Now, there are occasions where we want something to be applied regardless of how specific it is. And we can do so using the important keyword. And this will essentially override the default specificity based on the efficiency of our selector so that we can get the job done. So here I'm using the important keyword to say, regardless of more specific selections, I want this rule to pretty much always be applied. So the important keyword basically increases the specificity weight of the CSS selection that we've created. So now, watch what happens when we refresh our page. Because I use the important keyword, I've basically disabled the ability of this rule to cascade down and be more specific about the behavior that we want. The important keyword can get us into a lot of trouble. And in general, you want to limit your usage of the important keyword because you want to embrace the ability to get more specific about the aesthetics that you're looking for. So use this important keyword sparingly, but just know that you have it as a tool in your toolbox to basically be very opinionated and specific about the element changes that you want to be able to make and enact using CSS. Cool. All right, so we talked a little bit about how we're applying things like width, height, margin, padding, and border We talked about the important keyword. We talked about using this interactive tool to visualize the box model, and we'll make sure that that's available to you in the resources. And we also use Chrome Inspector as a tool and as a visual cue to manipulate and change the height, width, padding, border, and margin of our HTML elements as well. So play around with the CSS box model. What I would really love for you to do is add some dimension to your profile page. Again, continuing to increase the aesthetics and use more tools to make a more beautiful web page and website. The other thing I wanted to ask is, as you're getting deeper into the CSS work that we're doing, I want you to start thinking about your resume. So many folks have a resume in Microsoft Word or another tool, word processing tool. I want you to spend some time over the next few weeks getting your resume updated and well put together. In subsequent episodes, we're basically going to use everything that we're learning in terms of HTML and CSS to build a version of your resume that you can put online. So stay tuned with that, stay with me on that, and if you don't have a resume just yet, go ahead and start to produce one in, say, a Microsoft Word or a Google Docs so that we can take that and we can put it online. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me in Slack. Please show me screenshots, and don't forget to include your markup when you share those screenshots. And I'm just going to do one last check and make sure that we're good on questions. Looks like we are. All right. So I want to thank you for sticking around with the box model idea and the concept. Again, like I said, it's a difficult one to master, difficult one to really grok and understand. So keep playing with it, keep manipulating rules in your Chrome Inspector, keep adding these box model rules to your bio page. And as we get deeper into the course, we're going to be using these to a point where it's going to start to feel like second nature. So I hope to see you in those episodes. I can't wait to start building our resumes together and putting those online. We'll see you next time. I think we're going to be covering how to link to external style sheets and work with multiple files in the context of a larger web project. So join us next time. We'll see you Tuesday.